It was an unprecedented sight, a sitting premier standing to give testimony in an Ontario criminal court. On trial, two prominent Liberals, including the premier's own former deputy chief of staff. Barely 9 months before an election, those are tough optics for Kathleen Wynne, whose personal approval ratings are already in the basement. Will it matter in the long haul? Joining us now for more, Martin Redcon. He's the Ontario politics columnist at the Toronto Star, and Alison Jones, Queen's Park correspondent for the Canadian Press. Good to have you two back in those chairs in our studio today. I'm going to take the assumption that not everybody know. I mean, people have heard stuff about this, but they don't necessarily know who all the main players are and what the issues are. So I want to start with some background. Martin, I'm going to give you 4 names. I want you to give me a line on each name because they're important players in this trial. Andrew Olivier.
Defeated candidate in the 2014 provincial election and wanted to run again in 2015. Having lost that seat, the Liberals weren't sure they wanted him, tried to shunt him aside, and he had them on tape and went forward with that.
He had him on tape because he's a quadriplegic and he can't take notes, so he records conversations. Glenn Thibeault.
Former New Democrat MP, head of the federal caucus, disenchanted with Mulcair, the NDP leader, wanted to switch parties and switch jurisdictions, and to do that, not cross the floor, but run again for office. Now our energy minister, MPP in Sudbury, and allegedly offered the bribe, if you want to call it that, of a cabinet position and other jobs for his staff.
Inducement is a gentler word, I think.
Yep.
Patricia Sorbara.
Key campaign official, basically was running the and planning the next provincial campaign for Kathleen Wynne and her deputy chief of staff. She was among those who taped by Andrew Olivier when she was trying to let him down and encourage party unity when they were trying to bring Glenn Thibeault in as their candidate.
Let him down gently with some,
right.
You can't be the candidate, but maybe there's something else for you.
Now on trial.
Now on trial. Gerry Lougheed Jr.
Local Liberal loyalist, doesn't do him justice, fundraiser extraordinaire, a very important person in that town. And he was trying to act as a bridge, as a go-between, and he too was taped by Andrew Olivier and in some fairly awkward and embarrassing conversations.
They are the main players. Alison, you were up in Sudbury, you were covering this. Here's some of your reportage. The bribery section of the Election Act says, no person shall directly or indirectly give, procure, or promise or agree to procure an office or employment to induce a person to become a candidate, refrain from becoming a candidate, or withdraw his or her candidacy. The Premier testified this week. Highly unusual. What did the prosecution think the Premier could contribute to our better understanding of all of this?
Well, as Martin mentioned, the conversations between Lougheed and Olivier and between Sorbara and Olivier were taped for the reasons you mentioned. We know that Wynne also spoke to Olivier in between those two conversations. That wasn't recorded. He had technical difficulties at the time. So I think one of the most important things the Crown wanted to get into evidence was, what did the Premier herself, as the leader of the party, tell Olivier? What message did she send to him? They also wanted to hear what, if anything, she told Lougheed and Sorbara before they spoke to Olivier. And we also heard from her a bit about the sort of political intrigue behind the decisions that surrounded the by-election. As Martin mentioned, you know, they weren't very happy about losing the Sudbury seat in the 2014 general election.
Yeah, I mean, she wins a majority government, but she loses Sudbury, which the Liberals had always held
for about 2 decades before that. So she had thought, maybe Andrew Olivier was not as strong a candidate as we had previously thought. So she sort of talked about her thinking around that and why she didn't want him as the by-election candidate.
How did she do up there on the stand?
Well, you know, I said earlier today to somebody that, you know, Wynne is no stranger to harsh questioning. She gets it every day in question period. I'd argue even harsher than the lawyers in question period, sometimes from the media. So, you know, she handled herself relatively well, maintained composure. I don't think there were no sort of big bombshells or revelations out of what she said. I think she probably accomplished what she set out to do, told the narrative that she set out to tell without any stunning revelations. You know, she was called as a Crown witness, but the story in her mind that she was telling was helpful to the defense. So it was sort of a weird situation where neither side of lawyers really went after her that hard or that aggressively.
2 courts here. The court that she testified in, the Court of Public Opinion as well. At the risk of getting into sticky legal morasses here, to what extent, I mean, the Premier's not on trial, but to what extent in the court of public opinion is she, in your view?
Absolutely on trial, and the public is a far harsher judge, one might assume, than any courtroom judge. A courtroom judge comes at this, one expects, objectively with an open mind and no preconceptions. The public, as you mentioned in your introduction, is not particularly enamored of Kathleen Wynne right now. Her personal opinion, public opinion ratings are very low. They're below 20%, 19 to 14% from month to month. And she helms a government that's been in power since 2003. So they've had some scandals, they've had some boondoggles. People are of a mind to assume the worst. So while in a courtroom an accused is given the benefit of the doubt, bearing in mind that she's not the accused in this case, she was a witness, in the court of public opinion, a politician is just basically assumed to be corrupt. What she needs is an acquittal for these two people.
She needs that because?
That might help to clear her name amongst some of the doubters in public opinion.
Allison, I want to read a couple of your tweets from earlier this week. Sheldon, you want to bring these up to amplify, as we say? Here's the first one, Brownberry. That's the Twitter name for the leader of the opposition, Patrick Brown. Brownberry uses first question period back from summer break to ask about Hydro One rate increase application. And there's another one now. Here's Andrea Horvath, the NDP leader, uses her first question to highlight Liberal trials, asking about allegations from Sudbury trial. Always interesting to see what the two opposition parties focus on during question period. They have different priorities, and clearly indicated here. The NDP decided to go after the Sudbury bribery case. How useful is that as a strategy in question period?
Well, they used that day almost every single question they had to ask about one of the two trials that are ongoing. So I think it's pretty clear they intend to keep highlighting this. You know, Martin talked about the court of public opinion before, and I think that's what both opposition parties are going to hone in on. I'm not so sure that acquittals will really move the needle in either direction for her naysayers. I think, you know, people who are already very critical of Kathleen Wynne and her government, I'm not sure acquittals will matter in their minds, and I think the opposition parties know that, and I think they're going to keep hammering the government on both of these trials, on both of these scandals, long after we see verdicts delivered.
Yeah, but, listen, I don't usually weigh in on these kind of things, but my hunch is that people think politicians are mostly bad apples anyway, and that, you know, if anybody skates on this or is found not guilty, they're going to say, oh, well, they got off, and, you know, there's probably something there, but they didn't. Anyway.
I would just say acquittals would be better than convictions.
Oh, yeah, I think that's fair to say. Okay, that's fair to say. But now I want to go with you on this one here. I mean, the PCs have had their own irregularities with nomination meetings and police investigations, and there are a couple of lawsuits going on surrounding some of the irregularities on those nominations. So one has to ask whether it's a wise strategy for Patrick Brown and the Conservatives to go after the Liberal irregularities as it relates to this Sudbury business. What do you think?
Well, I think they are skating on thin ice. I don't think the public perception is quite as pronounced. There hasn't been as much coverage of Patrick Brown's problems. The Globe and Mail had a full-page story about it the other day. Shady dealings, they called it. But certainly, if that progresses to a higher level of discomfort, you know, tape recordings that are embarrassing, police investigations, litigation, it will come back to haunt Patrick Brown. The NDP is having a little more fun with this and pushing harder. They've had some irregularities of their own on nomination battles in previous years. Adam Jambroni's contested nomination a few years ago in Scarborough. So the point is, all the politicians are involved in this kind of horse trading and horse whispering and horse whipping. So at a certain point, you know, you can't generalize with voters, but a certain segment of the electorate is wise to this and recognizes that they're all the same. Other people who are more partisan or perhaps don't follow politics that closely will say, oh no, it's the Liberals who are corrupt and the Tories would never do this and the New Democrats would never do this. Well, think about that for a moment. It doesn't really add up. So I'm not sure how much this, at the end of the day, will actually help the Conservatives on election day. If there are convictions on this and the other gas plant trial that's coming in a little while, it's going to hurt the Liberals more. But at some point,
what if there's convictions in the Conservative nomination situation?
Well, I think that will hurt Patrick Brown.
Yeah, and it's a mess. Okay, let's pick up. I want to pick up on something you said in your last answer, which is, yes, there is a second criminal trial taking place right now. It has to do with the gas plant cancellations. It has to do with the scrubbing of hard drives, which the allegation is Dalton McGuinty's former chief of staff, David Livingston, ordered and was carried out by a couple of other Liberal functionaries. Again, everybody's presumed innocent until proven guilty. The Premier, the former Premier himself, Dalton McGuinty, is not under investigation. There are no allegations against him involving any of this. That's important to put on the record. But there are two trials ongoing right now related to the Liberal Party of Ontario. Do you have a view on which trial is more problematic for the current Premier?
Well, certainly the gas plants trial, I think, is more serious. It is a criminal case, whereas the other one is an Election Act case, a very sort of down in the weeds kind of provincial offences type case. But the Sudbury case is one that has happened from start to finish entirely under Wynne's tenure as Premier. She's obviously involved, not charged or on trial, but you know, she comes up in the evidence, as was evidenced by why she was asked to testify. It involves one of her very top advisors, Pat Sorbara, and whereas the other one, gas plants, as you mentioned, was sort of a McGuinty era scandal. I think that allows Wynne a bit more distance from that trial, but I think also at the same time, the fact that both are happening at the same time means that a lot of people will sort of conflate the two in their minds, regardless of whether one is a Wynne scandal and one is a McGuinty scandal, whether one is criminal and one is not. I think just the general optics of having two Liberal-related trials happening at the same time are quite problematic.
Clearly, the Premier's office had a discussion about whether or not Kathleen Wynne ought to use her parliamentary privilege and not testify in this Sudbury by-election, and ultimately they decided to do it. What were the pros and cons you think they were debating?
To me, it sort of seems like a bit of a lose-lose situation either way. On the one hand, if she chooses to use that parliamentary privilege and not testify, it makes it look like she has something to hide, and certainly I think that would have been the opposition narrative. On the other hand, the alternative, which became the reality, saw her testifying. Now we've got this image of very rare, perhaps unprecedented image of a sitting Premier testifying in a court case. It was interesting to note there were a number of court sketch artists there yesterday to capture that image. And I think that image itself is one that's going to follow her right through to the election. I think the opposition's going to capitalize on it. So you've got that image of the Premier in court, even if she's not personally facing charges.
Do you imagine that image might be seen again in a campaign ad somewhere 7, 8, 9 months down the road?
I imagine it might be.
I imagine it might be.
But the optics are terrible. But if that helps the chances of an acquittal, then that helps to reduce the impact of those sketches at campaign time. And as for the gas plant trial, which Alison points out is a criminal trial, this one isn't. We all call it the gas plant trial. I'm actually not sure it's about gas plants. We can talk about that in the future as that case unfolds. But that is a very complicated trial, and it's not. I never make predictions, but it's not a sure. That's not a slam dunk for the Crown either. And so it's quite possible that when all is said and done, the Conservatives and the NDP will have to find something else to run on.
I have something else I want to say. I want to quote Martin Reg-Kahn, who's a writer with the Toronto Star, who wrote this: "To borrow a hockey analogy, and as much as I oppose fighting in the NHL, imagine if a losing coach filed assault charges every time an opposing player threw a sloppy punch. When you criminalize the competitiveness of the political game, and when you weaponize the Election Act, you arrive at the absurdity that is Sudbury." Sounds to me, Martin, like you think this whole thing's a crock.
I do. Certainly in Sudbury. The allegation is that Olivier was induced to not run by this dangling of appointments, government appointments. Most government appointments are actually unpaid. Pat Sorbara also talked about party positions, volunteer positions. There was talk of a constituency assistant position. As best I can determine, the average where the typical constituency assistant salary is in about the mid-$30,000. Andrew Olivier is a man of some means. So the idea that these were bribes or inducements is kind of laughable. The idea that Glenn Thibeault was bribed to give up his job as chair of the federal NDP caucus with the prospect of a cabinet appointment, which he actually wasn't, there was no deal because he wasn't given a cabinet appointment when he switched over, when he was elected in that by-election. It took him about a year, I think, to finally get into cabinet, and it's well known, you can look at the track record, that Kathleen Wynne never appoints rookies to cabinet. She believes they should be seasoned as backbenchers. So the idea that somehow, by virtue of being given a promise or an undertaking that some of his staff would actually be able to come over with him, and that's what induced him to give up federal office and clamber over and climb up the greasy flagpole of provincial politics.
You're not buying.
Is to discount entirely his personal political ambition.
Allison, we got 10 seconds left. Do you have any idea when we're going to get a verdict on this?
I imagine it would be a couple of weeks to a couple of months after each of the trials wrap up, which is set to be sort of mid to end of October for each of them.
Gotcha.
So perhaps by the end of the year, perhaps early next year.
Gotcha. Thanks to the two of you, Martin Redcon of the Toronto Star, Allison Jones of the Canadian Press. Good to have both of you on TVO tonight.
Pleasure.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.